A young widow living in her car inherited a $6 mansion from her late husband's estranged family. But what she discovered hidden in the basement would not just make her rich, it would change the meaning of everything she thought she'd lost. If you've ever felt like your story was over, only to find a new chapter waiting in the most unexpected place, then hit that subscribe button and stick with me. This one's for you. The cold was a physical thing. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the fabric of the driver's seat, in the condensation that traced ghost-like patterns on the inside of the windshield, in the deep, unshakable ache in my bones. For 6 months, my world had been the interior of a 2011 sedan. Home was a 19-square-foot box of steel and worn upholstery, parked in the back corner of a 24-hour supermarket lot where the lights were just bright enough to feel slightly less alone, but dim enough not to keep you awake. My husband, Liam, had been gone for 10 months. The life we built, the 2-bedroom apartment with the leaky faucet and the balcony that caught the morning sun, that was gone in 4. It evaporated in a flood of legal notices and debt statements I never knew existed. His death, they said, was an accident. A fall at a construction site he was surveying. Quick, tragic, senseless. The debt he left behind was slow, methodical, and made a cruel kind of sense. It devoured our life savings, then our apartment, then my future. I learned the rhythms of this new life. The best time to use the supermarket restroom without drawing attention. The exact angle to recline the seat to minimize the cramp in my left leg. The particular hum of the refrigeration units on the back of the store that became a kind of white noise, a lullaby for a life I didn't recognize. My days were spent in the public library, pretending to look for jobs online while mostly just trying to stay warm. My nights were spent here, watching other people's lives unfold in the brief, illuminated moments they moved from their cars to the automatic doors. A mother buying diapers at 2 a.m., a group of teenagers laughing over a stolen six-pack, a man in a suit buying a single, sad-looking microwave dinner. Each one a story I could watch but never be a part of. I had become a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that was still moving on without me. The mail was the only thing that still tied me to the person I used to be. I kept a P.O. box, a small, recurring expense that felt like an anchor to sanity. It was mostly junk mail and final notices for bills I couldn't pay. But one Tuesday, wedged between a credit card offer and a flyer for a pizza place, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy, important. The return address was a law firm in a town I'd never heard of. Port Blossom, Maine. My fingers were numb with cold as I fumbled with the seal. The paper inside was crisp, expensive. It smelled like dust and money. The letter was addressed to me, Elara Vance, but the subject line was about Liam. Specifically, the estate of Arthur Vance. Arthur. I vaguely remembered Liam mentioning a great-uncle by that name once, years ago. A recluse. A family black sheep who lived in a crumbling house on the coast and had disowned everyone, or been disowned by them. Liam hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the core of it was brutally simple. Arthur Vance had passed away. He had no other living heirs. His will, drafted 30 years ago, named his grandnephew, Liam, as his sole beneficiary. And since Liam had predeceased him, the inheritance passed to me. My breath hitched. Inheritance. The word felt like a language from another planet. People like me didn't get inheritances. People like me got eviction notices. I scanned down the page, my heart hammering against my ribs with a confusing mix of hope and dread. The estate consisted of a single asset, a property. 14 Blackwood Lane, Port Blossom, Maine. And then I saw the numbers that made no sense. The property was appraised at a value that made my head spin, a number with 6 zeros after it. But the estate was also insolvent. It was buried under decades of tax liens, municipal fines, and private debts. The total liabilities were staggering, far exceeding the appraised value of the house itself. The law firm, on behalf of the state, was making me a one-time offer. I could assume the title of the property and all its debts. Or I could relinquish my claim and the state would seize the property, auction it off to the largest creditor, a development corporation, and the matter would be closed. There was a final, bizarre paragraph. A provision in the town charter, a legal loophole from the 1800s, meant that to assume the title from an insolvent estate, a direct heir had to pay a symbolic reclamation fee to the town council. The fee was $6. I read it again. $6. For a mansion that would then immediately drown me in a debt so massive it was almost comical. It was a joke, a cruel, elaborate joke being played on a woman living in her car. Who would accept such a thing? It was a trap, a poison pill wrapped in the fantasy of a windfall. It was an offer of a bigger, colder, more permanent prison than the one I was already in. I laughed, a dry, rattling sound in the silent car. I laughed until the tears started, hot and angry, freezing on my cheeks. $6 for a $6 million problem. It was the most absurd thing I had ever read. And in the numb, gray landscape of my life, absurdity felt like a spark. It was something. It was anything. I folded the letter, my fingers tracing the crisp edges. The address seemed to burn through the paper. 14 Blackwood Lane. A place. A destination. My life was a series of circles in a parking lot. This was a straight line. I didn't know what I was going to do, but for the first time in months, I felt the faintest whisper of a question mark at the end of my story, instead of a bleak, silent period. The next morning, I used the last of my emergency cash to put gas in the car. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay in that parking lot for one more night. The letter felt like a weight in my glove compartment, a heavy, unread chapter. I drove to the library, but instead of logging onto job sites, I typed Port Blossom, Maine, into the search bar. It was a tiny fishing town on a remote stretch of coastline, famous for its dramatic cliffs and persistent fog. Then I searched for the address, 14 Blackwood Lane. The first result was a real estate listing from 5 years ago, already expired. The photos were grainy, taken on an overcast day that made the house look like something out of a horror movie. It was a Victorian, maybe even Gothic revival, with a steep, gabled roof, a pointed turret on one corner, and elaborate, rotting gingerbread trim. It was enormous, a 3-story monster perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the churning Atlantic. The listing described it as a historic property with significant restoration needs, which was real estate code for ruin. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling in long, leprous strips. The grounds were a jungle of overgrown weeds. It looked less like a house and more like a shipwreck that had washed ashore a century ago and been left to rot. Then I called the number for the law firm on the letterhead. A crisp, female voice answered. I asked for the lawyer who had signed the letter, a Mr. Alistair Davies. When he came on the line, his voice was exactly as I'd imagined. Old, dry, and tired, like rustling leaves. "Ah, Mrs. Vance," he said, without a trace of surprise. "I confess, I didn't expect to hear from you." I told him I had received his letter. I asked him if it was real. "As real as the tax code, I'm afraid," he sighed. "It's a peculiar situation, I'll grant you. Arthur Vance was a peculiar man." I asked him why he would even send the offer. Why not just let the state take it? "Because the law requires it," he said, his tone flat. "As the wife of the designated heir, you are the next in line. You have the first right of refusal. It is my duty to inform you of that right, however ill-advised exercising it may be." He was telling me not to do it. A lawyer telling a potential client to walk away. "Let me be plain, Mrs. Vance," he continued, as if reading my thoughts. "The creditor, a company called Northlight Development, has been trying to get their hands on that property for years. They hold the largest lien. The moment you sign those papers, they will bury you in legal filings. They want that land. The house is worthless to them. The cliffside it sits on is not. Taking this deal would be financial suicide. "What's the catch with the $6? I asked, the question sounding childish even to my own ears. "There's no catch," he said. "It's a relic, a homestead reclamation clause from 1888, designed to help families recover property after a fire or a bad fishing season. It was never meant for a situation like this. It's a fluke that it even applies. But it does. For $6 and your signature, you can claim the deed. You will be, for all intents and purposes, the owner of Blackwood Manor." Blackwood Manor. He called it a manor. The name felt as oversized and ridiculous as the house itself. "And the debt?" I whispered. "The debt becomes yours instantly," he confirmed. "Several million in state and federal tax liens. Another million in private notes owed to Northlight. You would be one of the most debt-ridden individuals in the state of Maine." I should have hung up. I should have said, "Thank you for your time," and thrown the letter in the nearest trash can. But something held me back. Liam. He had never mentioned this place, this great uncle, this history. His family was a closed book, one he'd never offered to open. His parents had passed away when he was young, and he'd been raised by an aunt who wanted nothing to do with the Vance side of the family. He had been as much of an orphan as I was. Maybe this house, this ruin, was a piece of him I never knew. A piece of the puzzle of who he was, and why his life ended in a way that left mine in pieces. "I want to see it," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of him tapping a pen on his desk. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice softer now, less formal. "The photographs don't do it justice. It's in a state of profound disrepair. It's not safe." "I'm living in my car, Mr. Davies," I said, the admission tasting like ash. "My definition of safe is currently quite flexible." The silence that followed was different. It was heavy with a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. "The town of Port Blossom is a 2-day drive from where you are," he said finally, his tone shifting from legal advisor to something more human. "If you are serious, I will meet you there. I have the keys. I will walk you through the property. And then you can make an informed, though likely still catastrophic, decision." 2 days. I had enough gas for maybe half of that. I had $43 to my name. It was insane. It was the only thing that made sense. "I'll be there," I said. "Friday, around noon." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I looked out the library window at my car, my sad little metal shell. It wasn't a home. It was a waiting room, and I was done waiting. I sold my last few possessions of any value, a tablet, a pair of earrings Liam had given me for our first anniversary, at a pawn shop. It gave me another $200, enough for gas and cheap coffee and the $6 fee that felt like a ticket to another world. The drive east was a blur. I drove through states I'd only ever seen on a map, the landscape changing from the flat, predictable grid of the Midwest to the rolling hills and dense forests of the Northeast. With every mile, I felt like I was shedding a layer of the gray numbness that had enveloped me for months. Fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was mingling with something else now. A wild, terrifying flicker of anticipation. I was driving toward a ruin, toward a mountain of debt, toward a decision that everyone would call insane. But I was also driving toward the last unknown piece of the man I loved, and that felt like driving home. Port Blossom didn't so much appear as it coalesced out of the thick coastal fog. One moment I was on a winding, 2-lane road surrounded by dense pine forest. The next, the trees thinned and I could smell the salt and brine of the ocean. The town was a clutch of weathered, salt-bleached buildings huddled around a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed like patient old men. It was beautiful, in a stark, lonely way. I followed the GPS up a steep, winding road that led out of the town center. The road was called Blackwood Lane. It quickly devolved from cracked pavement to a gravel track, the trees closing in on either side, their branches clawing at the car. And then I saw it. The house was even more intimidating in person. It didn't just sit on the cliff. It seemed to grow out of it, a jagged, dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the sky. Mr. Davies was right. The photos hadn't done it justice. They hadn't captured the sheer, overwhelming scale of its decay. It sagged. The whole structure seemed to be sighing, giving in to a century of gravity and Atlantic gales. The turret on the corner leaned at a precarious angle. Half the porch had collapsed, its splintered timbers lying in a heap on the overgrown lawn. But beneath the rot, there was a strange, stubborn grandeur. The lines of the roof were elegant. The tall, narrow windows spoke of a forgotten grace. It was a dying queen of a house. A sensible black sedan was parked near what was once a gate. A man in a tweed overcoat stood beside it, his silver hair whipped by the wind. He was tall and thin, just as his voice had suggested. He watched me pull up, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Vance," he said as I got out of the car. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "Alistair Davies, you made good time." "I didn't stop much," I said, my voice feeling small in the vast, windy silence. My eyes were fixed on the house. It was hypnotic. "Well," he said, pulling a large, rusty iron key from his pocket. "Here we are, the seat of the Vance family's spectacular decline. Shall we?" He led me up the crumbling stone steps to the front door. It was a massive slab of oak with a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a wolf's head. The key scraped and groaned in the lock. With a shuddering crack, the door swung inward, opening into darkness. The air that rolled out was thick and cold, carrying the scent of damp stone, rotting wood, and something else, something like old paper and forgotten time. It smelled like a tomb. We stepped inside. The foyer was vast, the ceiling soaring 2 stories up into the gloom. A grand staircase, its banister thick with dust, curved up into the shadows. Furniture stood like shrouded ghosts under white cloths. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grime on a massive stained glass window high above, casting a few pathetic, colorful splinters onto the floor. "Arthur was the last one," Mr. Davies said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "He lived here alone for 50 years. No electricity for the last 20. No running water for the last 10. He was eccentric." He gestured into a room off the foyer. The parlor. I stepped in, my boots crunching on something. I looked down. The floor was covered in a carpet of dead leaves that had blown in through a broken window pane. The furniture was exquisite, or it had been once. A velvet settee, its fabric now shredded and faded. A grand piano, its keys yellowed and several missing, like broken teeth. It was a room full of ghosts. We moved through the ground floor in a kind of grim procession. The dining room, with a table long enough for 30 guests, was now home to a family of raccoons. The library was a scene of heartbreaking destruction. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but thousands of books had fallen and lay in swollen, moldering piles on the floor. The damp had turned a universe of stories into pulp. Every room was a fresh, new vista of decay. It was worse than I could have imagined. It was hopeless. "Why didn't he sell?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Why let it get like this?" "Pride," Mr. Davies said simply, "and spite." Northlight Development's founder, a man named Silas Croft, had a feud with Arthur's father back in the 50s. Tried to force him to sell this land. It got ugly. The Vances lost everything else, but they held on to this house. For Arthur, letting it rot was better than letting a Croft have it. He led me to the back of the house, to a small, cluttered room that must have been a study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room looked used. There was a simple cot, a table with a kerosene lamp, and shelves filled with canned goods. "This is where he lived," Mr. Davies said. "The last 10 years, just in this one room." On the table, next to the lamp, was a small, locked wooden box. It looked out of place, cleaner than everything else around it. "What's that?" I asked. "I don't know," the lawyer admitted. "It was here when the coroner came. It's locked." Probably just personal effects. He looked at me, his gaze direct and serious. Mrs. Vance, Ilara, you've seen it now. This isn't a house, it's a mausoleum. It's a money pit from which there is no escape. Northlight is waiting. They will not be gentle. You can walk away from this right now. Go back to your life. I'll even give you gas money to get wherever you need to go. No one would blame you. He was offering me an escape. A clean break. The sensible part of my brain, the part that had survived the last year, was screaming at me to take it, to get in my car and drive until the smell of salt and decay was gone. But my eyes kept drifting back to the small wooden box on the table. And I thought of Liam. I thought of the unanswered questions, the secrets he must have kept. This place, this disaster, was his last secret. Walking away felt like burying him all over again. I looked at the lawyer, at this kind, pragmatic man who was trying to save me from myself. I took a deep breath, the cold, musty air filling my lungs. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "Where do I sign?" He just stared at me for a long moment. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He looked resigned. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit impressed. He slowly nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Very well," he said, pulling a folded document and a pen from his coat pocket. "Your funeral." I signed the paper on the dusty table, my signature looking thin and spidery next to the official seals. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills I'd been saving. I smoothed out a 5 and a 1 and handed them to him. $6. I had just bought a mansion. The weight of what I had done didn't hit me right away. It came in waves. The first wave was a dizzying, terrifying euphoria. I owned something. After losing everything, I owned this colossal, crumbling, magnificent wreck. I walked from room to room, no longer as a visitor, but as its keeper. This was my parlor, my library, my disaster. Mr. Davies left me with the big iron key and a small, sad smile. "My office number is on the document," he said. "You'll be hearing from Northlight's lawyers before the week is out. Call me when you do." Then he was gone, his car disappearing down the overgrown lane, leaving me alone with the groaning house and the sound of the sea. The sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping fast. The house had no power, no heat, no water. My car, parked outside, was still my only real shelter. I retrieved my sleeping bag, a gallon of water, and the small bag of food I had. I decided to camp in the small study where Arthur had lived. It was the most self-contained, the least daunting room. Before I settled in, my curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the wooden box on the table. It was simple, made of dark wood with a small brass lock. There was no key. I searched the desk, the shelves, my pockets, but found nothing. Frustrated, I picked it up. It wasn't heavy, something shifted inside. I shook it gently, a faint rattling. I ran my fingers along the edges, the bottom. And there, I felt it. A tiny, almost invisible seam. It wasn't a lid, it was a false bottom. I dug my fingernails into the crack and pried. The thin sheet of wood popped off. Inside, there wasn't a key. There was a letter. It was in a sealed envelope, and the name on the front made my blood run cold. It wasn't addressed to Arthur, or to me. It was addressed to Liam. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely tear the envelope open. The letter inside was written in a spidery, weak hand, the kind of script that comes from age and infirmity. It was from Arthur, and it was dated just 3 weeks before Liam's death. "My dear boy," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the house is now yours. I imagine you are surprised, I imagine you are angry. You have every right to be. Our family has brought you nothing but silence and shadows. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for the distance. It was a necessary cruelty, or so I told myself. I had to sit down. I sank onto the edge of the dusty cot, my heart pounding. This was a voice from the grave, speaking to my dead husband. I am not leaving you a home, Liam. I am leaving you a weapon. This house. It is the only thing our family has left, and it is the key to everything. For 60 years, the Croft family has been trying to take this land. First Silas, now his grandson, Richard. They are not simple developers. They are thieves. They built their fortune on stolen land, on lies, on lives they destroyed. Our family was just one of many. They ruined your great-grandfather. They blackmailed my father into silence. And they have been waiting for me to die so they can finally bulldoze this house and erase the last piece of evidence against them. I read on, my breath held tight in my chest. Arthur explained that the house wasn't the prize, the land was. But not for the view. The cliffs beneath the house were riddled with old smugglers' caves from the 19th century. During Prohibition, the Vances and another local family, the Abernathys, had used them. But after Prohibition, Arthur's father discovered something else in those caves. A rare mineral deposit. Not valuable enough for a full-scale mining operation, but significant. He'd had it surveyed, legally and quietly. The mineral rights belonged to the owner of 14 Blackwood Lane. The Crofts knew. That was the secret war. It wasn't about a plot of land for condos. It was about mineral rights worth a fortune. They cannot take the house by force, Arthur wrote. The deed is ironclad, but they have bought the debt. They have surrounded it with liens, waiting to starve me out. They think that when I die, the state will seize the property and sell it to them, the primary creditor, for pennies on the dollar. They think they have won. They do not know about you. And they do not know what is hidden in the basement. My eyes snapped to the last 3 words. What is hidden in the basement? The letter continued. I cannot tell you where it is, not in writing. Paper can be found, paper can be burned. But I can give you a clue. Your grandmother, my sister, loved poetry. She always said the heart of this house wasn't the hearth, but the foundation, where the cold stone keeps the house's secrets. The basement, Liam, but not the one you can see. The house has more than one. Find the old wine cellar. Your great-grandfather walled it up after the tragedy. Find the cellar, and you will find justice for our family. You will find the proof. All the original surveys, the deeds, and the evidence of Silas Croft's crimes. Everything you need to destroy them. This is your birthright, Liam. Not a fortune, but a fight. The only thing of value I have to give you. Be careful. The Crofts are patient, but they are not kind. They will not expect you. That is your only advantage. Your loving uncle, Arthur. I let the letter fall into my lap. My mind was reeling. Liam, he had gotten this letter. He must have. He must have come here. He must have been looking. And then he died. His accident. A fall at a construction site. Or was it? A cold dread, far deeper and more chilling than the air in the house, crept over me. What if it wasn't an accident? What if the Crofts, this Northlight Development Company, found out he was here? Found out who he was? I felt sick. I stumbled out of the house and was violently ill in the overgrown bushes. The whole world had tilted on its axis. The story I had told myself about Liam's death, a story of bad luck, of random tragedy, had just been ripped to shreds. He hadn't died because of a stupid accident. He had died because of this house. Because of a secret he had discovered just weeks before. He hadn't left me with debt because he was reckless. He had accumulated it to fight a secret war I knew nothing about. He was trying to protect me. By keeping me in the dark. By making his financial life a mess. He was creating a smokescreen. He was trying to win this fight, claim the justice Arthur wrote about, and then come back to me. But he never made it. I stumbled back inside, the grief hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I didn't just lose him. I lost him without ever knowing what he was fighting for. I cried. I sat on the floor of that cold, dark tomb of a house, and I cried for him. For the secrets he carried alone. For the fear he must have felt. I cried for the naive, trusting wife I had been, who never saw the weight he was carrying. And I cried for me, for the utter, terrifying loneliness of this new knowledge. The house wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a crime scene. It was a battlefield. And the fight wasn't over. He had passed the torch, not to Liam, but to me. This was my inheritance now. Not the house, not the debt. The fight. And as the tears subsided, something else took their place. A cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was anger, a burning, righteous fury. They had taken my husband. They had destroyed my life. And they thought they had won. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Listen, if you've made it this far, I know this is a lot. Maybe you've had a moment in your life where everything you thought was true turned out to be a lie. Where you felt completely and utterly alone with a truth no one else could understand. If you have, I want you to know you're not alone. This community, this channel, it's for people like us. People who have been through the fire. So take a breath. And if you feel like sharing a piece of your own story, the comments are a safe place to do it. I read them all. Your story matters. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It means the world to me. Now, let's get back to what happened in that house. Because finding that letter wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the real search. The next few days were a blur of methodical, exhausting work. My grief had a new shape. It was no longer a paralyzing fog, but a motivating fuel. I had a purpose. Find the wine cellar, find the proof, get justice for Liam. I started with the obvious. The house had a main basement, accessible through a heavy wooden door under the grand staircase. The stone steps leading down were slick with damp. The air was frigid and smelled of wet earth and mildew. The beam of my heavy-duty flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing a cavernous space filled with the detritus of a century. Old furniture, broken crates, rusted-out machinery, jars of unidentifiable preserved things that had long since turned black. It was a labyrinth of junk. I spent 2 full days down there, moving heavy objects, my muscles screaming in protest. I was looking for a walled-up doorway, a seam in the stone, anything that looked out of place. I tapped every inch of the foundation walls, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. It was solid, ancient stone. After the second day, covered in dirt and cobwebs, my hope began to fade. Maybe Arthur was delirious when he wrote the letter. Maybe the tragedy he mentioned had led his father to destroy the cellar completely, not just wall it up. I was running out of food, and my body ached. Discouraged, I went back to the library. Not to search, but just to sit. I felt a strange connection to the room, to the thousands of destroyed stories lying on the floor. I picked up a book, its cover swollen and its pages fused into a solid block. As I held it, a line from Arthur's letter echoed in my mind. Your grandmother loved poetry. The library, of course. Maybe the clue wasn't just in the house, but in the books. It was a long shot, a desperate one, but it was all I had. I started searching the shelves, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Most of the books were ruined, but on the highest shelves, near the ceiling, some were protected from the worst of the leaks. I found a rickety ladder in a closet and climbed, my flashlight beam dancing over faded spines. And then I saw it. A single, slim volume of poetry, tucked behind a row of thick, leather-bound encyclopedias. It was by a poet I didn't recognize. The title was Songs of the Sea. I pulled it out. It was dry, Someone had deliberately hidden it there. I opened it. On the inside cover, in the same elegant hand as Liam's grandmother, was an inscription. "For my Arthur, may you always find your way in the dark, E." And on one page, a page with a poem called "The Stone Heart," a single line was underlined in faint pencil. "Below the new wood, the old wine sleeps." Below the new wood. I sat on the ladder, the phrase repeating in my head. New wood. In a house where everything was a century old, what could be new? I thought back to my initial tour of the house with Mr. Davies. The floors were all original dark oak, almost black with age. Except for one place. In the kitchen, a huge walk-in pantry at the back. I remembered noticing it because it was so odd. The floor in there wasn't dark oak. It was pine. Lighter, cheaper. It had looked like a patch, a repair, a new floor. I scrambled down the ladder, my heart racing, and ran to the kitchen. The pantry was a narrow, deep room, its shelves empty except for a thick coating of dust. I got on my hands and knees, the flashlight beam illuminating the floorboards. They were newer, probably laid down sometime in the mid-20th century. Below the new wood, the old wine sleeps. This had to be it. I didn't have a crowbar. I ran outside to the collapsed porch and found a thick, splintered piece of timber that was long and relatively sturdy. I used it as a lever, jamming it into the crack between two floorboards. I put all my weight on it. The old nails groaned in protest. Wood splintered, and then, with a loud crack, the first board came loose. My hands were raw, my back was screaming, but I didn't stop. One by one, I pried up the boards, revealing the dark, earthy space below. And there it was. Not earth. Not a crawl space. It was a dark rectangle in the dirt. A heavy, stone slab with an iron ring set in its center. A trapdoor. The ring was cold and rusted. I hooked my fingers through it and pulled. It didn't budge. It was impossibly heavy. I felt a surge of despair. To come this far, only to be defeated by a heavy rock. No, I wouldn't stop. I went back to my car and got the tire iron. I wedged it under the edge of the slab and leaned on it with every ounce of strength I had. The stones scraped against stone. An inch. Then another. Slowly, painfully, I levered the slab aside, revealing a black, gaping hole. A set of steep stone steps descended into absolute darkness. The air that rose up was different from the rest of the basement. It was drier, colder, and it smelled, faintly, impossibly, of wine and earth and secrets. I retrieved my flashlight and, taking a deep breath, I started down the steps. The beam cut a sharp white circle into the black. The room at the bottom was small, no bigger than the pantry above it. It was a wine cellar. The walls were lined with empty, arched alcoves for bottles. It was made of the same rough-hewn stone as the main foundation. But one wall, the back wall, was different. It was brick. Newer brick, laid with more precision. A wall that didn't belong. This was the wall Liam was looking for. This was the wall that had cost him his life. I ran my hands over the bricks. They were cold and solid. I tapped them, just as I had in the main basement. Here, near the bottom, I heard it. A faint but definite, hollow sound. There was a space behind it. Using the tire iron again, I found a spot where the mortar was crumbling. I jammed the pointed end in and twisted. The mortar cracked, falling away in a shower of dust. I worked for what felt like hours, chipping away at the mortar, loosening one brick, then another. Finally, I had a hole big enough to shine my light through. It wasn't a room full of treasure. It was a small, hidden cavity, a secret compartment inside the foundation itself. And inside, sitting on a small wooden shelf, were two metal deed boxes. They were rusted, but intact. My hands shook as I reached in and pulled the first one out. It was heavy. The lock was rusted shut. I used the tire iron again, forcing the lid with a screech of tortured metal. I lifted the lid. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't gold. It was better. It was filled with documents, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp. The original 19th century survey maps of the land, clearly marking the mineral deposits. The legal deed for the mineral rights, assigned in perpetuity to the owner of the house at 14 Blackwood Lane. And below that, a leather-bound journal. I opened it. It was the handwriting of Liam's great-grandfather. It was a detailed, day-by-day account of his dealings with Silas Croft. The threats, the intimidation, the financial ruin. It was a meticulous record of a crime written by its victim. The second box was harder to open. When I finally prized the lid off, I knew this was what Arthur had truly meant. This box didn't contain old documents. It contained audio tapes, dozens of them. The small kind, from a micro-cassette recorder. And there was a small, handheld recorder with them. A note, in Arthur's hand, was tucked on top. Liam, my father was a careful man, but I was a paranoid one. These are 50 years of my conversations with the Crofts. Every threat, every lowball offer, every smug admission. They never knew I was recording them. The batteries in the player are probably dead, but the tapes are eternal. Burn them. Burn them. The name of Northlight's current CEO. Richard Croft's grandfather was Silas. His father was named Burnside Croft. He went by Burn. I put a tape in the player, my fingers fumbling. Of course, the batteries were dead. I would have to find a way to play them. But I knew what was on them. It was the weapon Arthur had promised. It was leverage. It was proof. It was justice locked in a metal box for half a century. And then I saw the last thing at the very bottom of the box. A thick, sealed manila envelope. My name was on it, Ilara. It wasn't in Arthur's hand. The handwriting was clean, familiar. It was Liam's. My heart stopped. He had found this place. He had been here. He had opened these boxes. And he had left this for me. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long, and a thick stack of $100 bills. My eyes blurred with tears as I began to read. My dearest Ilara, he wrote, if you are reading this, it means I failed, and for that, I am more sorry than words can ever say. I'm sorry for the secrets, for the debt, for the mess I've made of your life. I thought I could fix this. I thought I could be the hero, slay the dragon, and come home to you with a clean slate and a secure future. I never wanted you to see this place, to know this ugliness. He explained everything. How he'd received Arthur's letter, how he'd come to Port Blossom, found the hidden cellar, the boxes. He'd spent weeks going through the evidence, listening to the tapes. The debt he'd taken on wasn't for this fight. It was for me. The money in this envelope, he wrote. It's all I have left. I sold everything I could. It's not much, but it should be enough to get you somewhere safe, to start over. Take it and run, Ilara. Please. Don't be brave. Don't try to finish this. These people, the Crofts, they are monsters. They took my family's legacy, and I think they are going to take me too. They know I'm here. I've been getting followed. My accident is waiting for me. I don't have proof, but I know it. There is no winning this fight. There is only surviving. Your survival is the only thing that matters to me now. Forget this house. Forget the Vances. Go build a life, a beautiful life, for both of us. Know that every second of my last days was spent loving you. Always. Liam. And there, at the bottom of the envelope, was the money. Tens of thousands of dollars. Enough to get a small apartment, a car that wasn't a bedroom, a new life. It was his last gift to me, an escape hatch. He had spent his final days not just preparing for a fight he knew he would lose, but preparing a way out for me. He had accepted his own death to give me a chance at life. I collapsed onto the dusty floor of that hidden cellar, clutching his letter, and I sobbed. I wept for his love, for his sacrifice, for the impossible choice he had left me. Run, he had said. Forget this. But how could I? How could I take his money and let the men who killed him win? How could I let his death be for nothing? His letter wasn't just an escape hatch. It was a final piece of evidence. It was his testimony. I sat there for a long time, in the cold and the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his family. The choice was clear. Liam's last wish was for me to be safe. But his life's last work was this fight. To honor him, truly, I couldn't just accept one and ignore the other. I had to do both. I had to find a way to win, and I had to find a way to live. I carefully packed the documents, the tapes, and Liam's letter back into the deed boxes. I took the money. I would use it, but not to run. I would use it to fight. I climbed out of the cellar, my body aching but my mind clear and sharp. The first thing I did was call Mr. Davies. I found it, I said, my voice hoarse. I found everything. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mrs. Vance, he said slowly, perhaps you should come to my office. Right now. The next week was a whirlwind. Mr. Davies, once he saw the contents of the deed boxes, transformed from a weary country lawyer into a razor-sharp legal predator. The journal, the deeds, the survey maps, they were a powerful case. But the tapes were the kill shot. He hired a forensic audio expert to digitize them. They were 50 years of casual, arrogant evil. Burnside Croft, Richard's father, bragging to Arthur about how his own father, Silas, had legally outmaneuvered the Vances. Richard Croft, as a young man, threatening to have Arthur declared incompetent and locked away. Decades of coercion, all caught on tape. And then there was Liam's letter. It wasn't proof of murder, not in a criminal sense, but in a civil case? It was a narrative that would turn any jury against Northlight Development. Mr. Davies laid out the strategy. We wouldn't go to the police. The Crofts had owned this town for too long. We would go to the press. We would file a massive civil suit. Wrongful death, recovery of stolen assets, punitive damages. We would use the evidence to force a settlement so large it would either bankrupt them or force Richard Croft to sell his controlling interest in the company. They wanted to bury you in legal filings, Mr. Davies said, a grim smile on his face. Now, we get to bury them in the truth. The money from Liam funded the initial legal barrage. It paid for the experts, the filing fees, the private investigators Mr. Davies hired to track down other families the Crofts had ruined over the years. We found 2 more, and they joined our suit. The story broke in a major national newspaper. Historic Maine family's 60-year war against development giant. It was explosive. The tapes were the centerpiece. The arrogance, the casual cruelty of the Crofts, laid bare for the world to hear. Northlight's stock plummeted. Their board of directors panicked. Richard Croft issued a furious denial, calling me a delusional, gold-digging squatter. But the evidence was overwhelming. They tried to countersue, to drown us in motions. But they were on the defensive, and they knew it. The fight lasted 6 grueling months. They offered to settle early, to pay off the liens, and give me a small sum to walk away. I refused. This wasn't about money, it was about principle. It was for Liam. Finally, facing a public trial they knew they would lose spectacularly, they folded. The settlement was staggering. Northlight Development would pay a sum large enough to make my head spin. It would clear all debts and liens on the house, establish a multi-million-dollar fund in Liam's name for the preservation of historic properties, and pay out significant damages to me and the other families. It didn't bring Liam back. It didn't erase the pain. But it was justice. Cold, hard, financial justice. Richard Croft was forced out of his own company. His family's reign was over. After the settlement, I was, on paper, a wealthy woman. The world saw a headline, "Widow wins millions." They saw the money, but they didn't see the real treasure. The richness I found wasn't in the bank account. It was in the truth. It was in understanding the man I married, in knowing the depth of his love and the courage of his convictions. It was in reclaiming his story from the lies that had buried it. I paid Mr. Davies, who tried to refuse his fee until I insisted. I set up trust funds for the other families, and then I was left with the house. Blackwood Manor. It was mine now, free and clear. It was still a ruin, but now it was a ruin with a future. I didn't sell it. How could I? It wasn't just a house. It was a monument to my husband's love. It was our story, written in stone and rotting wood. I used a portion of the settlement money to begin the restoration, not to turn it into a polished museum, but to bring it back to life. I hired local craftsmen, people from Port Blossom whose families had been there for generations. We started with the basics: a new roof, new windows, stabilizing the foundation. We tore out the rotting parts and found strong bones underneath. Slowly, painstakingly, the house began to breathe again. I live here now. Not in the one small room where Arthur hid, but in the whole house. I spend my days managing the restoration, my hands covered in dust and paint. The grand staircase is steady now. The library's books are being carefully restored by an expert I hired. The parlor has new velvet on the settee. It's a long process. It will take the rest of my life. But I have the time, and I have the purpose. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I walk down to the cliffs and look at the churning sea. I think about Liam and Arthur, and the generations of Vances who held on to this place with nothing but pride and spite. They held it for me. They just didn't know it. They left me a weapon, and I used it. But they also left me a home. I found more than riches in that basement. I found my husband's final testament of love. I found a cause worth fighting for. And in the wreckage of my old life, I found a new one. One that I am building with my own two hands. This journey taught me that inheritance isn't always about what you're given. It's about what you choose to do with it. Sometimes the most broken things, the things everyone tells you to throw away, are the things that can save you. They can give you a reason to get up in the morning, a fight to win, a home to build. What did this story teach you about the meaning of home, or the value of a promise? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. Thank you for walking this path with me today. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe and join us. There are so many more stories to tell. And remember, no matter how broken things seem, you are stronger than you know. You just have to find the right foundation to build on.